how do leaders create this kind of imagination and get buy-in that invites people in the church to move in that direction? That's the question. Okay, Sally, how do we want to come about this?
I don't have the answer. I can just speak about, from my experience.
Yeah, go ahead. I
think from my experience, leaders need to not allow themselves to be just framed by the expectations of a congregation, as good as they might be, around the role of the leader being mainly a pastoral role for a group of Christians. I think if that's the expectation of a congregation, you're not really going to make that shift. But if the leader is called to see mission in a new way, to try to key into some of the what's available in the community, and to spend more time in the community, and models that, other people will see that's actually Christian mission happening. So, of course, it's easier to start a church where everybody kind of gets that vision. So we planted a church and we've steered a church, and it's much easier to plan. But I also don't think we should give up on the idea that these wonderful existing congregations are not also getting a bit tired, maybe, of doing the same things that aren't working. So I guess it could be incremental. So it could be about challenging, maybe closing a bit of program in the church and inviting people, maybe through a preaching series like Acts and the encounters in Acts, to spend more time doing things that would give them opportunities to really meaningfully engage with people in their community. So that could be through sports projects, for instance, or, not that the church set them up, but that people have got time to do this and relate this to what God is saying to them in the church. But it definitely helps that I don't have a full stipend. So I spend 2 days a week lecturing at university. And that alters people's perspective of what I'm able to do as a minister and what I do as a minister. So perhaps it's being bold sometimes from the leadership structures down, to start to live out a more rounded life where you're not just relating to people within your congregation or your denomination, and even you're not mainly relating to people in those contexts, but you're seeing what the gospel looks like when you're doing other things. But it's all part of your mission and ministry. It's all part of you being a follower of Jesus. I'm not sure if that answers the question, actually.
It's fine. Good.
I think, Alan, it'd be great to have you respond to Sally and actually Paul Billard's comment and question that this isn't really about transitioning church anymore. We're actually talking about rebirthing something new. So he's used this language of rebirthing and transitioning.
Yeah, the language I would use, rebirthing is a good word. The language Martin and I are using in the book we've just written is refounding. So this is way more than a new technique or fixing up what we've got. And part of this question of leadership, then, this is a massive shift of imagination and practice. And so there's a legitimacy in the question of how do you go about that? And let me just share briefly a couple of stories that would illustrate this. My colleague and I, Mark Laubranson, were working with a group of clergy over numbers of months who are asking this very question. And our comments to them were, you can't begin with the question, how do I do this in my church? i.e., go past the billboard and engage in the community. You actually have to begin practicing this for yourself. And we invited them into what you call a learning community of about 6 of them with very simple practices. Keeping the daily office, setting aside time in which they were entering the neighborhoods where they lived, and ways of connecting with people. And it was it was a profoundly disorienting experience because they'd actually never done that before. And their lives were so busy with their church work that they were fundamentally disconnected from the neighborhood and communities where they lived. And so very gently, we began to do this with them. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole thing, but together with some mentoring, if you will, and some practices, it was phenomenal what began to happen. And how the imagination of these clergy began to shift. And what I would say is that we can't approach the question of what do we do in our churches without ourselves entering that practice. And it was last month, as we were listening to these clergy describing what had taken place, where, for example, one of them is describing the relationship they were developing with a bakery around the corner that they never knew existed. Yeah. And the conversations that were starting to go on about life in that bakery and how that bakery was starting to become almost like a center of relational engagement and activity that this clergy person had never imagined. But even beyond that, one of these clergy people began to say how he was so consumed with his church life that he had lost the capacity to have conversation with his wife. And now, you know, here's a clergy person. It could be a husband, could be whatever. But and the practices of being present in the community, of taking time to start doing that, began to fundamentally remake the relationships he had at home. Now, these are the critical pieces. These are, if you will, the revolutionary refoundings that we're talking about are going on. Now, the second part of the question, and I'll stop, is that I can think of a Lutheran community that I was with recently, where a guy my age, grumpy guy, just like me, was talking about this. Well, I don't know what's going on in our church and all of that kind of stuff. And he was just invited to tell some stories about what he did. And in the telling of the stories, and that's what's critical. How do you get people, how do we begin by inviting people to start telling stories of what they're up to and the things that are niggling them and going on inside of them? He starts telling a story of going to, I think it was a football game, a particular Canadian football team I won't mention, and how he kept noticing a guy off in a corner who worked there who had a broom to clean up. And it was stunning to listen, because if you listened, what you could hear is that in the heart of this grumpy old guy, he loved to talk to what he saw as a lonely guy pushing a broom. And inside of that were all the clues to where God's life was at work and where this grumpy old church guy was discovering a Lydia. So this is not a big program.
No.
It's about a whole way of life and a repatterning of what we're doing. So those are some ways I probably talk.